I'd like to welcome you to the University of Scranton this evening. My name is Julie Schumacher-Cohen, and I'm very glad to serve the university as Director of Community and Government Relations. Thank you for joining us tonight for a very special lecture that is a collaboration of the university and Times-Shamrock Communications. And together we're honored to present as our guest speaker the Irish Ambassador to the United Nations, David Donoghue. We're gathered here on March 1st, the start of a month that includes, of course, one of our favorite feast days of the year, St. Patrick's Day, celebrated in Scranton with none other than the second largest parade in the country. And as we like to say in Scranton, on parade day, everyone is Irish. I found this even applies to me as a transplant to Scranton, although I'm still searching my family ancestry for some link. But in fact, 30% of Scranton's population today is of Irish descent, and they've had, of course, a tremendous impact on this region. So we're honored to have the ambassador with us tonight. He'll be discussing Ireland's role in the world, sustainable development, peace, and human rights. The university enjoys a rich history of bringing members of the global diplomatic community to northeastern Pennsylvania. In just the last couple of years, ambassadors representing Rwanda, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan have spoken on campus here. They've enriched our understanding of the complexity of global politics and the common challenges that bind us together. We're especially grateful to Dr. Eugene Haluka, a university parent twice over, who is here in the audience. And he has provided wonderful support in helping us to bring some of these special speakers to campus. So thank you, Dr. Haluka. Here tonight to offer their greetings and introduction is our university president, Father Kevin Quinn, and George Lynett, CEO of Times-Shamrock Communications and a member of the university's Board of Trustees. After Ambassador Donoghue offers his remarks, there will be an opportunity for Q&A, so we'll invite you to offer your questions, and there is a microphone right up here in the front. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce the president of the University of Scranton, Kevin Quinn of the Society of Jesus.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Julie. And I have to say, unlike Julie, I'm Irish 365 days of the year. There's actually more. I come from a very proud Irish Catholic family, Geary, Doherty, Daly, and Quinn, from counties Monaghan, Limerick, Cork, and Galway. My paternal grandfather, Patrick Quinn, the last of my Irish grandparents to cross the pond, arrived in New York City in 1916, only 100 years ago. So when I had the opportunity first to meet Ambassador Donoghue last year in New York City, I was very excited about the possibility of bringing him to campus. Welcome, Ambassador Donoghue. We are so glad that you are here in Scranton, the capital of Ireland on this side of the Atlantic. Our university is 127 years old, and our city of Scranton is celebrating its 150th anniversary this year. Both our university and the city enjoy rich ties with Ireland. Irish immigrants of Northeast Pennsylvania have played a critical role in the history and heritage of this region. Indeed, the founder of St. Thomas College, which would later become the University of Scranton, was the first bishop of Scranton, William O'Hara, who was born in Dungiven in County Londonderry. It was his vision to provide Catholic higher education for the people of his diocese, to educate the sons and daughters of coal miners, that has brought us to where we are today. Our connection to Irish heritage and culture can be found in many ways on campus, but we are particularly proud of the Francis E. and Elizabeth Brennan Reddington Scholarships, which support scholarships for students from the Republic of Ireland each year, including 2 students who are here tonight. Maybe they could stand. I am most pleased to have Ambassador Donoghue here to share the work he is doing on behalf of a country that we all hold near and dear to our hearts. I am eager to hear about the important work he is doing at the United Nations to promote more sustainable development, greater peaceful resolution of conflicts, and a more robust commitment to universal human rights. In particular, Mr. Ambassador, I applaud your leadership in helping world leaders to come to agreement that eradicating poverty is the greatest global challenge, and that we must act together to heal and secure our planet. Indeed, Pope Francis spoke at the UN this past fall, and he called on nations to, quote, put into practice a shared ideal of fraternity and solidarity, especially with regard to the poorest and those most excluded. These kind of lectures are integral to our efforts to educate our students in ways that are engaged, integrated, and global, with perspectives that broaden our outlook and invite us to consider how we can act on behalf of those most vulnerable in our local, national, and international communities. I want to thank Times-Shamrock Communications, our partners in bringing us tonight's lecture. Once again, a most hearty welcome to all who have joined us this evening and joined Ambassador Donoghue. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Quinn. And now, George Lynott, if you'd come and introduce our guest speaker, President and CEO of Times-Shamrock Communications.
Thanks, Julie. I guess it's no surprise that a company called Times-Shamrock was asked to sponsor the ambassador tonight. But thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be able to introduce Ambassador Donoghue. And it's certainly appropriate that we welcome the ambassador at the beginning of what we like to call the High Holies here in Scranton, the parade and St. Patrick's Day. And I know there's a lot of parade committee people out here. I saw them coming in. But it's a great time to be in Scranton, as Father said, the Irish capital of the United States. Times-Shamrock and the university go back a long way. In fact, St. Thomas College, as it was known, was the ripe old age of 7 when my great-grandfather, Edward J. Lynott, a first-generation American, whose parents were born in Ireland, founded what would become Times-Shamrock in 1895. And to share what Father Quinn did, I'm a Lynott, O'Hara, Sweeney, and Brady. And I think the main counties were Sligo and Armagh. That's all right. Sligo's a good one anyway. Sligo's on the right side. But the university and my family have been closely intertwined ever since. We feel very strongly about the university and its mission. We're constantly aware of the many positive impacts the university has in our community, from the massive economic impact to the great work of the Leahy Clinic and lectures like this one, which are open to the public. So it's with great excitement that Times-Shamrock presents this lecture tonight with the university. David Donoghue has been ambassador and permanent representative of Ireland to the United Nations since 2013. In 2014, he served as a co-facilitator with Kenya of major UN negotiations, which led to the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in September of 2015. Prior to his appointment as permanent representative, Ambassador Donoghue held the position of political director, of course they're going to stick together, of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Dublin from 2009 to 2013. He previously served as an Irish ambassador to Germany, Irish ambassador to Austria and the Vienna-based UN agencies, and Irish ambassador to the Russian Federation with side accreditations to Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. I hope you get back there often. From 2001 to 2004, Ambassador Donoghue was Director General of the Irish Government's Development Cooperation Program. He also has extensive experience in Anglo-Irish relations and was involved in the negotiation of the Anglo-Irish Agreement and the Good Friday Agreement, and served as Irish head of the Anglo-Irish Secretariat in Belfast from 1995 to 1999. From 1977 to 1991, he had postings in various Irish embassies. An Irish national, Ambassador Donoghue holds an MA in German and a BA in French and German from the National University of Ireland. It is my great pleasure to now introduce to you Ambassador David Donoghue.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I thank Father Quinn and George and Judy for their kind introductory remarks. I feel almost as if I'm among family, coming home in a way with the very strong Irish flavour of the university and indeed the city. I once spent a year in Philadelphia as I was growing up, and that's the nearest I've been to Scranton, though I've always known of it, but I had a year in Philadelphia where I was sent to a Quaker high school, a rather odd experience for an Irish Catholic, but I survived it. And I'm afraid I didn't have a Jesuit education in Ireland. I was sent to the Holy Ghost Fathers, but we can't all be perfect. So I've managed to get over those drawbacks. I'd just say I'd like to make a few remarks about Ireland's role in the world. I mean, partly it's my job at the UN to find that role, to give it profile, but it says something about the values also which we hold dear in Ireland. We're a small country, that goes without saying. We've been through a fair amount of adversity ourselves in terms of our historical experience. One thinks of the famine in the 19th century, which precipitated a large wave of emigration in this direction. One thinks also of the political history, history of discrimination and oppression, finally independence in the 20th century. All of these factors gave us a certain sympathy with, first of all, other countries who have been through a difficult gestation, other countries who have suffered in various ways. And I'm in the first instance, I'm talking about countries in the developing world, in Africa, in particular, where there has been a colonial experience. We understand that experience, we've come through it, we've become an independent country, and we have fared reasonably well in the world, and now we have excellent relations with our neighbours, in particular the United Kingdom. I have to say, on an aside, that after I spent a large part of my career working on the problem of Northern Ireland and Anglo-Irish relations or British-Irish relations, it's particularly gratifying that in the last couple of years, thanks to the resolution of the Northern Ireland problem, we now enjoy excellent relations with Britain, which would not have been necessarily predictable. We had a superb visit by the Queen a few years ago, which none of us thought would be possible in our lifetimes. That's just by way of an aside. So Ireland has changed a lot in the last 20, 30 years. We have had, as you know, we had a period of great economic prosperity in the 90s, followed then in 2008 by a severe financial crisis from which we're only now recovering. But we are back on track, and we are slowly getting back towards the conditions of the 90s. And right now we have an election which has left a rather uncertain result, so it will take a couple of weeks before that clarifies. But all of that really is just by way of quick background to what I wanted to say. It can sometimes be the case that a small country at the UN is given a particular role, a chairmanship of some kind, which can help to raise the profile. So I was fortunate last year to be asked to take on a particular chairmanship, which in fact turned out to be the biggest thing that the UN has ever done. And it's referred to in shorthand as the 2030 agenda. Let me just explain briefly what that was about. In the year 2000, there were so-called Millennium Development Goals, which were agreed for the whole world. There were eight of those, and they dealt with things like education and health and a number of purely development objectives. Those goals lasted for 15 years. So in the year 2015, a successor set of goals had to be devised. But this time round, it was decided that these would be much more ambitious goals, that they would cover a far wider range of issues. And so that means that whereas the Millennium Development Goals focus purely on eradicating poverty, the new goals, which are called the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs for short, these new goals cover everything from poverty eradication to saving the planet to creating conditions for balanced economic growth around the world. And this concept is the approach we took is described as sustainable development. That means it's development which is not going to fizzle out a couple of years later, but it's really tackling the problems of the world in a fundamental and lasting way. So to give you an example, you're not going to be able to tackle poverty in a poor developing country unless you also look at climate change and environmental degradation. These two things are linked. And so in a word, it was decided that we had to really focus on three things simultaneously: poverty eradication, environmental preservation, and balanced economic growth. So by tackling all three dimensions together, the theory is we will get to lasting solutions to these problems. By tackling them in isolation, we won't. So this concept, the term is not particularly easy to use, sustainable development, and indeed for a while we toyed with various ways of replacing it. But I was impressed, on the other hand, by young people who came to the UN last September when we were announcing the new goals, and the young people had memorized the goals and were instantly at ease with the term sustainable development. So let's just say we hope it will catch on. The Millennium Development Goals also were a bit of a mouthful in the year 2000, but they somehow, or that term somehow caught on. So my job was to chair global negotiations at the UN involving every country in the world. And there are 193 member states of the UN, so almost 200. And myself and the ambassador of Kenya were chosen to chair these negotiations. They lasted for about a year, and they eventually produced agreement on 17 sustainable development goals and 169 subsidiary goals, with really sort of supported ones. So to give you an example, one of the 17 goals might relate to health, health issues of all kinds. The subsidiary goals might be maternal health, children's health, HIV/AIDS, a range of subordinate issues under that. So this new framework, it's slightly awkward, 17 goals and 169 targets, as they're called. This new framework is collectively called the 2030 Agenda, and I think you will hear more about it over the coming years. It's fair to say that at the UN, there's nothing else being talked about at the moment. Every single thing which the UN does is being measured in terms of the 2030 Agenda, whether it is human rights or even disarmament or peace and security. Everything is being seen as making a contribution to the 2030 Agenda. It's a little bit like a blueprint for the development of the world over the next 15 years. And there are a couple of other things to say about it. One is that whereas the Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000 were not negotiated. They were simply written on the back of an envelope by a couple of UN officials at the time, and they were just announced. This time around, the new goals had to be negotiated and agreed word for word by almost 200 countries. And if you bear in mind the many conflicting agendas which all of those countries would have, you're talking about Russia, you're talking about the United States, you're talking about Suriname, you're talking about places you might never have heard of, tiny developing countries. All 193 had to agree to every word, so it was a tall order, but we got there in the end. And the other big difference is, and this is really the new thing, that the 8 Millennium Development Goals were focused on developing countries. So in effect, the rich world was saying to the poorer world, this is what we think you should do in order to lift yourselves out of poverty and in order to get development assistance, which we will provide. That was seen to be a somewhat patronizing approach, really, where the rich world told the poor world how it should behave in a way. This time around, a different approach was taken. It was decided that that every country in the world is to some extent a developing country. No country is absolutely 100% developed. We might talk loosely about the developed countries and the developing ones, but in practice, even the most advanced countries still have a way to go under one or other heading. So if I don't want to name names, it would be invidious, but if I think of, let's say, an affluent Northern European country which might already have done great things in the education sphere. Let's imagine that one of the targets is we want to have 100% access to third-level education. It might be that even in the affluent Northern European country, even there they've only achieved it to 97%, because there might be, say, recent immigrant families who are not yet integrated, etc. So even, if you like, that's at one end of the spectrum. And then you might take a country like Malawi. There I go, I've just mentioned one, but let's say you take some developing country in Africa, and it might have only achieved that to 20%. And then many of the rest of us will be somewhere in the middle. But no one country has achieved that target to 100%. And therefore, the approach now is that we will all set out on this road together. There's no one country which has a monopoly of wisdom or a monopoly of virtue. We're all doing it together, and we will help each other to get there. So the term we use is universality. That means that every country in the world is taking on the same set of commitments across health, education, environment, food security, water and sanitation, safe cities, oceans. I mean, this agenda is absolutely vast. There is nothing omitted from it. Every country in the world is taking on the same set of commitments, and that means that we will be measuring each other. Now, there is nothing punitive about this. It's not like a court where if you underperform, you are punished. That simply wouldn't have worked. This is it's a political and a moral agenda almost. We are putting pressure on each other to achieve these goals. But if individual countries are slow to achieve them or to make the progress we want, the worst that can happen is that they are politically embarrassed. There is nothing else. There's no sanction. The small developing countries who are way behind many of the rest of us would not have agreed to come into a framework like that if they felt that they were going to be punished in some way. So the only leverage we have to get these goals achieved is that a country X, if it is underperforming in one or other area, will feel embarrassed, exposed, maybe towards its neighbours. The regional aspect is important. Again, I have to be careful not to slip out a few examples here, but you could imagine a place like, say, Central America, you have, let's say, 10 or 11 countries there. Well, undoubtedly, some of those countries would want to be able to demonstrate to their neighbours that they are performing at the right speed. So there's an element of peer review and peer pressure, but that's the only leverage we have. Anyway, it means that, say, the United States has agreed to take on the same commitments as Afghanistan, and allowance is made for the fact that many countries are at a very primitive level of development, and they cannot achieve as much as others. But the actual text of the document which we negotiated speaks of taking account of national circumstances, priorities, and so on. I mean, I'm not going to spend the whole evening talking about this, but I just thought it was worthwhile to indicate to you the type of thing that a small country can sometimes be involved with. Ireland was chosen because we are seen as an honest broker at the UN. We are a small country, but with as I say, the colonial background. We understand the problems, the challenges faced by developing countries, perhaps more than others, and we're seen as reasonably independent-minded. So I don't want to portray us in saintly terms, but let's just say that a lot of other countries at the UN felt relaxed with Ireland as one of the chairs. And then Kenya was chosen for obvious reasons. It had to be the second country had to be one from the developing world. So that is a rule at the UN, one from the developed world and one from the developing world for any negotiation. So I worked with my Kenyan colleague for a year or so, and we got a good result at the end of it. There was a summit in September last. It was the biggest summit ever held at the UN, and in terms of the world leaders who came, the Pope, in fact, also attended. He was there on the first day, and it was a great moment when they gavelled through this agreement, and now it is as I say, the blueprint for global development over the next 15 years. So that was a satisfying involvement. The title of my talk is Sustainable Development, Peace and Human Rights. Now those are the three pillars of the UN. Development, peace in the sense of peace and security, achieving peace and security, and then human rights. Ireland has tried to be involved in each of those areas over the 60 years of our UN membership. Last year we celebrated 60 years. In the peace and security area, we have been particularly active as peacekeepers. Again, sometimes smaller countries are looked to play a role within UN peacekeeping operations. In 1960, Irish troops were first deployed to the Congo, and we had also a long involvement in South Lebanon. In fact, we're still there at the moment, and we are on the Golan Heights as well. That's between Syria and Israel. We don't have huge numbers of troops to contribute, but again, we tend to be seen as, honest broker wouldn't be the word, but we are not, for example, a member of NATO. That sometimes helps with Russia, to be honest, that Russia would tend to veto countries in NATO, and you have to have a country which is acceptable all around. But we also have a good record of peacekeeping service. We don't have a huge army, and we've never invaded anywhere, but the main purpose of our army has been to guard the border with Northern Ireland. That's not exactly a day-to-day job. I mean, there isn't huge pressure along the border, so we have been available for peacekeeping duties more than most, and it is, to be honest, a reasonably simple way of developing military experience. So we are proud peacekeepers and have been continuously serving with the UN since 1960. So we've had people somewhere in some mission around the world. That helps to strengthen our reputation, and that's also part of our work in my mission, which is the word for embassy. There's also a whole set of issues around which are referred to as peace building. If you have a conflict situation which is being resolved, you then need to find ways of helping that country to consolidate the peace. So when a ceasefire is declared, you then have to rebuild institutions which perhaps have been shattered during the conflict. You have to try to instill democratic values. You have to improve the governance in the country. There's a whole set of tasks which kick in once a ceasefire has been achieved, and that is referred to as peace building. Now, we in Ireland have had experience of the Northern Ireland peace process and of resolving conflict in that context. I can come back to that in a second. But because of our Northern Ireland experience, we have a particular interest in helping other countries to find solutions to their problems. In other words, at the level of mediation, and this is really soft conflict resolution. This is when the peacekeepers are gone, and instead the political scientists, the civil society groups, the government experts, they come in. So that is an area of work of increasing interest to Ireland. We've also tried to focus on the specific contribution which women can make to peace building and to conflict resolution. Where does this come from? Well, apart from general egalitarian principles, the Northern Ireland experience was important for us because, without exaggerating their role, there was a women's political party there which in fact had quite an impact, and Irish politicians felt afterwards that this was a dimension to conflict resolution which we could champion. So there is a resolution 1325 from the Security Council which is about women, peace and security, and Ireland has tried to take that forward, to pressurise other governments into bringing in national action plans based on that resolution. Just on the Northern Ireland issue, I'll talk very briefly about it. As George kindly mentioned, I was involved myself in the peace process over a long period, and it is an enormous relief to all of us on the island of Ireland that it was possible eventually to bring peace, to find a basis for lasting stability in Northern Ireland, but also on the island as a whole. We have a set of arrangements which were introduced by the Good Friday Agreement, and one of them is that there is a parliament in Northern Ireland called the Assembly, which has a government called the Executive, and that government shares power between unionists and nationalists. And I'm sure you'll be familiar with this, but this power-sharing executive has in fact maintained political stability in Northern Ireland for the last for nearly 20 years now, and even with changes of personnel and even with occasional crises, the arrangements have held up very well. And I should say that we were indebted at the time to the assistance provided by the US, notably in the form of George Mitchell, Senator George Mitchell, who chaired those talks. It was vital for the British and Irish governments to have an important third party as our partner, a third party which would be able to speak to both the Unionists and the Nationalists, and that was the US. And the US, in the form of both President Clinton and George Mitchell, were trusted by all sides to the Northern Ireland problem, and that really helped to get that particular agreement over the line. But I mention this Northern Ireland agreement just because it is one of the few examples of successful conflict resolution in the world, and therefore, to an extent, it gives Ireland legitimacy if we talk about conflict resolution. The other two parts of that agreement, incidentally, were that we set up arrangements for cooperation between North and South in Ireland on a lot of practical issues like energy, like environmental measures, even waterways, cooperation on the Irish language and a language you perhaps haven't heard of called Ullans, which is it's a local dialect in effect in Northern Ireland, but the reason I mention it is because it was important to the Unionists. So we wanted to show that the two governments, the Irish and British governments, were sensitive to both languages in Northern Ireland. But these arrangements whereby we plan our energy needs on a joint basis between North and South in Ireland, these are they have practical value, and they they help to strengthen the Northern Ireland economy. They strengthen our own. Tourism, for example. Tourism is now handled on an all-Ireland basis. So, at least to be precise, the marketing of Ireland is North and South. That is if you go to a tourism fair somewhere in the United States, you will find that Northern Ireland is being promoted as much as the Republic. The reasoning is that it's not realistic to imagine that tourists would come just to Belfast, just to Northern Ireland, but they are more likely to go to Northern Ireland if they are combining it with a visit to the South. So it's in the interest of both parts of Ireland to market the entire island. We had to reassure the Unionists at the time that this did not mean that we were proposing to take over Northern Ireland. Naturally, a few of them worried that we were, but it was purely a practical arrangement. It helps them, it helps us. And I mention that just as an example of the North-South arrangements. And the third and final part of the Good Friday Agreement was that we have a much closer relationship now on an East-West basis between both parts of Ireland and all the parts of Britain. So in the meantime, we have a separate Scottish administration, a Welsh administration. England is still there. The Isle of Man. There are a number of entities within Britain, and now there are much closer relations among all of them. So it was important for the Unionists to feel that we in the South were willing to cooperate more with the various parts of Britain, and it was important for the Nationalists to know that there would be closer links between North and South in Ireland. So much for the little lecture on the Northern Ireland peace process, but it's really where we come from if we offer advice to others around the world. I think I will wrap up my remarks by just referring briefly to the human rights agenda at the UN. Again, because we are a relatively new country, we have a written constitution. Our human rights record, it's not perfect, whose is, but we have taken a strong interest in human rights since the state was founded, and we therefore are very active in trying to strengthen universal human rights, and we will be seen as one of the most active players in that area. Recently, we had a 3-year term on the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and we tend to be identified with issues such as providing support for NGOs, for civil society in countries where human rights are threatened. We have a particular interest in helping human rights activists in countries all around the world. They are called human rights defenders. The term means it could be an environmental activist in Guatemala or a medical activist in Vietnam. There's a whole range of activity, and we try to ensure the rights of these people. There is an organisation in Dublin which is active in that area. I think I'll draw my remarks to a conclusion now. I've probably gone way over the time, but I'll be very happy to take questions on anything which occurs to you. I've probably left out some points of interest, but thank you very much.
Mr. Ambassador, what are the prospects for unification with the 6 counties in the north, and how assertive is the Republic in advancing that prospect?
Well, that's an absolutely key question. Okay, how strong are the prospects? I think myself that one day we could find that Northern Ireland, that there is a sort of a steady assimilation between the two parts of Ireland. That we are moving more closely together in terms of practical cooperation. And it means that almost in a quiet way, I don't want to say that the two parts are coming together, but that there's a habit of cooperation developing on all kinds of practical matters. But politically, the important thing is that there can only be a change in the status of Northern Ireland if a majority want that. That is a sacrosanct principle, and that is embodied in the Good Friday Agreement. So it's anybody's guess if you look at the demographics of Northern Ireland. Let's just say that first of all, nobody would want to define too precisely what a majority is, but I mean, that's the way it's written. Again, the Catholic population is not equivalent to the nationalist population. Not every Catholic believes in a united Ireland. So it is difficult to make a guess as to when, if ever, there would be a majority in favour of Irish unity. It's certainly not imminent. And I should say that in the South, attitudes have changed as well. You have a whole young generation which really knows nothing about Northern Ireland. The Troubles, as we used to call them, came to an end effectively in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement, but with the ceasefire of 1994 and 97. So young people today really know nothing about Northern Ireland, or sorry, they may know something about it, but the issue of reunification doesn't really mean anything to them. Conversely, young people in Northern Ireland are not particularly exercised by it in the other direction. It's really, it is an important part of the political. It's part of our history as a country, but it's not a burning issue on a day-to-day basis. What's more important is what John Hume used to describe as unity of hearts and souls. And I mean, it's not unifying territory which is important, rather trying to find a basis for sharing the island. And we're now in a better place than we were during those 30 years of the Trouble. So I'm sorry to duck the question, but effectively, I think the practical cooperation is the best. That gives us the best basis for moving forward.
Do general elections in Ireland always end up in coalition governments? And can you explain to the audience why?
I thought you were going to say, do general elections in Ireland always end up in the mess that we have at present, but and I was laughing in agreement in advance. We almost always have coalitions. The reason for that is that we have quite a complex electoral system called proportional representation. You know that. In Britain, for example, they have a very simple one. Arguably, it's too simple. It's the first past the post. So in Britain, there would be only one seat in each electoral district or each constituency, and almost invariably it's It's one of the two main parties which gets that. In Ireland, we have a system which is much more flexible, it's much more democratic, and it's also much more complicated. It means that you might have 3, 4, or 5 seats within a particular constituency. That means that if I am sitting down to vote, I don't just mark one X. I might, if there are, say, 15 candidates in my electoral district, I would have to arrange all 15 according to my preference. Now that means that I might decide to give my first preference to party X, and then I might decide, I quite like that local person who's not from any party, who's an independent. I'll give that person my second preference, and then I might decide to come back to another party for the third, and so on and so on. That means that an independent, sort of non-party candidate can prosper in our system, prosper almost too much, because it means that you could find that if there are non-party or independent people who have just one big local issue, we tend to, because it's a small country, if there is a burning local issue about the closure of a hospital, for example, an individual, a person seeking office just on that ticket could find that he or she gets elected to our national parliament, to the Dáil, because enough people feel strongly about that issue locally in that one district to send the person to Dublin to the Parliament. But it means that you get a mixture then between local issues and national issues, which is very democratic, but it can sometimes lead to unusual results. It also means that a national politician is held to account for his or her performance on the local issues. So it might be that the foreign minister, for example, we only have people who are elected from local districts, from electoral districts. If the foreign minister is away for 6 months of the year, he or she might still be thrown out the next time because they didn't pay enough attention to the closure of a local hospital. And so it means that local issues can loom large with us. And anyways, to get back to the issue of coalitions, if you have a situation where no one party is likely to dominate each time, where the vote is going to be diffused, well then more often than not you have to have a government involving a number of parties being put together. Sometimes you might have a government involving, say, 2 or 3 parties, and then some independent candidates, some independent members of the Parliament also supporting them, depending on the arithmetic. We have 165 seats in our Parliament, and you just have to come up with an arithmetical majority somehow. So it's a long time since we had one party securing a majority. I think the last time would have been about 30 years ago. So we now almost invariably have coalitions, but we're not alone. Britain for a long time had no coalitions, and now it seems unlikely that Britain can manage. You know, the British had a coalition in the last election, and so many countries, or in Germany, coalitions are almost invariable, Italy and so on.
Could you share with us your thoughts on Britain's upcoming vote on exiting the European Union?
Well,
both in terms of its probability and in terms of its effect on Ireland?
Again, very good, very, very good question. Okay, I'm not party to anything more than anyone else might know about whether it's likely to happen or not. But I can say quite honestly that we are worried about the possible, about the very definite impact if it happens, because of course Ireland and Britain are both members of the European Union, but we have a significant volume of trade with Britain, and for example, Ireland is the 6th biggest trading partner for Britain. Ireland, right now, we are a more significant partner for Britain than Brazil, Russia and China lumped together. It's quite remarkable. So we are tied economically to Britain in a big way, but it's more that we're worried about the consequences of a border being re-established or established, because the border in Ireland would then become the border between the EU and outside, as it were, and that's not a comfortable situation for either of us. We're in the European Union. We're trying to almost phase out borders. Well, they continue, but we are trying to make them less significant, and you'll see the separate issue altogether about migration and the migration crisis. The whole trend in the EU for the last number of years has been to make borders less of an obstacle to free movement and trade and so on. So this would mean, if we had Britain leaving the EU, it would mean that Northern Ireland is out of the EU, so the border within Ireland would become far more visible, and it would mean that cross-border trade, cross-border day-to-day contacts in Ireland would be impeded, and there are lots of sort of knock-on disadvantages for Ireland if there were to be a Brexit, as they call it, British exit, Brexit, so we hope very much that it won't come to that. But we don't say that publicly because, at least we don't say it in a British context, because we don't want to appear to be interfering in the affairs of another country. But you know, it is alarming.
Mr. Ambassador, would you give us a sense of what you perceive to be the leadership of Ban Ki-moon and what his legacy as Secretary General?
Well, Ban Ki-moon is you get different types as Secretary General. You get some people who are sort of strong moral voices, and that's how they present themselves. You get others who are administrator types, who are more sort of running a vast bureaucracy. I think Ban Ki-moon has managed to combine the two very well. He's been very effective in his 2 terms. It's difficult to make a snap judgment, but he has shown courage on a number of occasions, and he has identified himself very strongly with the issues I mentioned of development and climate change, most of all. Climate change was his, I say was because his term will come to an end at the end of this year, but climate change has been his biggest priority, and the Sustainable Development Goals. It would be fair to say that when we got the agreement through last August, September, he spoke of it in euphoric terms. I mean, everybody describes it as the most important thing that the UN has done in years, and because it's so huge, there is nothing, there was no bigger agenda or document of the UN than what we did. And Ban Ki-moon was the one who began that process and who encouraged countries to work for a new set of development goals. So that has been very important. I should say that this is not related to Ban Ki-moon, but this year's major challenge is about migration and refugees, and by a happy coincidence, I've been given a new role in relation to that. So there's to be a summit which Ban Ki-moon has convened. That's why Ban Ki-moon has asked world leaders to come to a summit in September at the UN, and it will, for the first time, address both migration and refugees. I mean, they are 2 separate categories, but the summit will address both. And I've been asked to prepare that summit with the ambassador of Jordan. Jordan is obviously a country which is on the front line, and so we've just started our work now, and it is linked in a way to the Sustainable Development Goals, because if eventually the Sustainable Development Goals are implemented, that should remove the reasons for these unfortunate people in Syria and elsewhere to leave their homes. I mean, they said that the new agenda tries to tackle conflict by addressing underdevelopment. So ultimately, I know it's a utopian ideal. But ultimately, if the goals are implemented, then the Syrian population will be able to stay in Syria and will not have to migrate. Now I'm putting it in rather simplistic terms there, but in a way, the migration and refugee crisis has the capacity to prevent implementation of the new goals, because countries, donor countries in Europe and elsewhere, are struggling to absorb well, some of them don't want to absorb them, but you can see what Germany and others are doing. They're struggling to deal with this crisis. It's a little bit difficult at the same time to focus on the development needs of some of the countries of origin. So the two issues are linked, and for my sins, I now have a new set of negotiations ahead of me over the coming months to prepare a document which the world leaders would issue in September. Again, Ireland has been chosen because of our honest broker reputation, but also I think partly because it happens that we do not have a major refugee crisis. Why is that? Because we are situated so far to the northwest of Europe that the Syrian refugees, it's too complicated for them to get to us. We in fact have an open door policy, and we would be happy to receive, but they are mainly heading for Germany, as you can see, and Sweden. But I think because the crisis is not affecting us particularly, it's easier for Ireland to chair those negotiations. But Ban Ki-moon, to sum it up, I think there will be a very good verdict passed on him when he finishes at the end of the year. He's done quite a lot of real value in the last during his 2 terms.
Mr. Ambassador, congratulations on the many accomplishments that you've achieved. It's really remarkable. In the past, population control has been a kind of a difficult issue under the guidelines that are seen in the past. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that's been addressed this time and how it's come together for the various countries that have different views of that.
Yes, that's well. You put your finger on one of the most sensitive issues on our agenda while we were negotiating these goals. As with many sensitive issues, we eventually had to find language which was just about acceptable for all countries, and that was tricky, as you can imagine. The phrase population control or population growth doesn't in fact feature in the agenda, as I recall. There is a reference to sexual and reproductive health and rights, but carefully qualified. Countries, again, I don't want to pick them out, but some of the more conservative developing countries were obviously a little bit anxious about what might be expected of them in relation to what I'll describe as population control. But they were finally happy with the language that was achieved there. You inevitably have to balance a sort of more liberal agenda against a more conservative agenda and fudge certain things which might cause difficulty in one or other direction. Remember, I was with the ambassador of Kenya, so in a way we both had to come up with the language on all issues which would be acceptable. So I'm probably fudging right now, but let's just say that we agreed a lowest common denominator approach, and it wasn't the most sensitive part of the agenda. It is true to say that human rights in a broad sense, there were many perspectives on that, and obviously Western countries for the most part have a more advanced view of human rights than some developing countries. So again, we had to work hard to, this is not your point, but it's a wider point I'm making, we had to work hard to find some language which would keep them all happy, and we just about got away with it, but it wasn't easy. What we were trying to avoid was a situation in which, when the document was being adopted, one or other country would stand up and say, we reserve the right to not do what's being proposed there, or we object to this, object to that. We wanted to avoid that. The document had to be adopted by consensus. There was no vote. A vote would have been impossible. We had to bring it to a point where myself and my Kenyan colleague just picked up a gavel and just gavelled it through. And what we were trying to ensure was that in that last meeting there would be no reservations. And the reason I mentioned it in relation to your question is because it was precisely in the area of sexual morality and so on where we were where there was a risk of a split, and so we had to somehow gauge the moment when we had everyone on board, and we got it right. Luckily, there were no reservations. The whole agenda would have been undermined if there had been some group of countries objecting to some particular aspect. So it was a gamble. But
we have a gift for you here. It's a University of Scranton history book, so you can always keep Scranton and the university in your heart and on your coffee table. And so I just want to thank you for the work that you've done on behalf of Ireland, but also on behalf of all of us, as you've spoken so eloquently in your role at the United Nations, and particularly now on the refugee issue, which is something that has been very close to our hearts as well here at the university. I mentioned when I opened the evening that I can't claim any Irish heritage, but I can claim as one of my favorite poets, the great Seamus Heaney. And so I thought I would send us off this evening with an excerpt from his poem, The Cure at Troy. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So indeed, Ambassador Donoghue, we wish for your work and the world that we're sending our students out into, that justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for sharing your work. And thank you for all of you for joining us.